This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Seminar 6, Lectures 3 to 7. Part 2 of Seminar 6 on desire and dreams centers on a case presented by Freud of an individual who had a dream in which he encounters his deceased father, illustrating the central questions addressed throughout these lectures, which are the following. How are desire and unconscious fantasy expressed and recognized through dream analysis? And how is this analysis aided by considering the split in language between statement and enunciation? In the case of dreams, it's not necessarily the presence of signifiers, but the absence of them that creates new meanings. Lacan likens this metaphorical effect to the summoning of shades by necromancers, where the presence of the shade holds significance due to what is left unsaid. The repressed signifier, the signifier that is absent, is where desire can be located. To appreciate how this is so, Lacan reviews one of Freud's cases wherein the subject presents a dream in which his father was alive and talking with the dreamer, his son. The client's father in real life had recently died after a protracted illness. Since we'll be returning to this dream quite frequently throughout this video, it'll be helpful to quote Freud's description of the case here. His father was alive once more and was talking with him in his usual way, but he felt it exceedingly painful that his father had really died, only without knowing it. The key to analyzing the dream is not only what is made explicit, but what is left unsaid here. Freud again writes, the only way of understanding this apparently nonsensical dream is by adding, as the dreamer wished, or in consequence of his wish, after the words that his father had really died, and by further adding that he, the dreamer, wished it to the last words. The dream thought then runs, it was a painful memory for him that he had been obliged to wish for his father's death as a release while his father was still alive, and how terrible it would have been if his father had had any suspicion of it. This addition to the text is what Lacan calls a clausule, which in rhetoric is where a rhythmic figure is used to add finality to the end of a sentence, creating a sense of closure. Lacan will elsewhere use the term punctuation, wherein the meaning of everything that came before gets retroactively transformed. Going back to our two questions, we find here how, according to Lacan, Freud approaches the dream via the signifier. The signifier in this instance being as the dreamer wished, which follows two other signifiers, he is dead and he did not know it. This demonstrates the connection between dreams and desire via language, referring to our first question. As such, it initially seems the desire expressed via the dream is that the subject wanted the father dead. It is expressed not by being made explicit in the text of the dream, but by being subtracted from it. But the problem is that the subject was already consciously aware of this wish. There's really no surprise here that he wished his father dead in real life. And it was on this basis that Freud was able to add the signifier back in the dream. So it wasn't just randomly placed there by him. But what is of significance here is that this consciously held wish was subtracted from the text of the dream. While not repressed in waking life, it was repressed in the dream. This subtraction or elision creates a signified effect, a metaphorical effect. Okay, but then what is the importance of this signifier gone missing? We don't get an answer from Lacan in this lecture, but he hints at an answer by comparing this elision of the clausule as he wished with psychosis, wherein a subject misrecognizes another's death or their own, what in neurology is called Cotard's delusion or walking corpse syndrome. Is there something significant here about being half dead, so to speak, being alive while believing one is dead? Or perhaps more adequately, the inverse, being dead while believing one is alive, as is the case here in the dream. Lecture 4 draws connections between Freud's distinction between primary and secondary processes and the two chains found in the graph of desire. What are those connections? For Freud, as Lacan presents it here, the primary process is associated with a fragmented desire that, when blocked from being expressed and fulfilled, leads to a regression that produces a hallucinatory satisfaction of desire, and where the mind cannot distinguish between the representation of a desire and its actual fulfillment. Superimposed upon these hallucinatory phenomena are inscriptions, or as Lacan calls them here, signifiers, giving rise to a new signifying organization and a second system of significations that is the secondary process. This secondary process appears to streamline these signifiers derived at the level of the primary process, facilitating the subject to identify objects of demand that take into account the constraints of external reality. These two processes are not sequential but operate simultaneously within the same subject, despite there being an implied genesis of the secondary system resulting from the first. How does this discussion of primary and secondary processes connect to the two chains that form the graph of desire? Like the primary process does for the secondary process, the upper chain forms the basis for the lower chain. The lower chain, also called the line of demand and location of the statement, what we called in the last video the enunciated, is overt speech. The upper chain marks the place of enunciation, where we find the process that goes into the formulation of overt speech rather than its content. The difference between the statement and enunciation is illustrated well in the example Lacan provides here. At such and such a time, I will have become her husband. This sentence contains two subjects, one explicit and the other implicit. The I of the I will have become her husband is the subject of the statement, the one who is spoken about and made explicit in speech. However, there is a second subject here, the I who is speaking right now. This I is not mentioned in the statement, but it would be impossible to make sense of the sentence if this I is not in some way accounted for. And for Lacan, language always involves this twofold structure. Yet there are times, perhaps quite frequently, wherein the subject of enunciation is erased or hidden some way via negation and repression. Herein we start to get into more indirect language acts, such as, it would be a shame if something was to happen to your shop, or perhaps more explicitly negation, I'm not saying that, dot, dot, dot. Here we have some attempt to hide the process of enunciation behind the statement. Now, while some of this may still be acknowledged in a negative form, in repression, it is completely excluded from conscious discourse. This repression aims at stopping something in the enunciation from entering into the statement, to leave something unsaid. And what is unsaid is connected in some way to the truth of desire, a truth that offends the authority of the law. And we have to always keep in mind that the speech at the level of enunciation is always the discourse of the other. It's not just some internal monologue of the subject itself. And as such, when something is potentially going to be formulated through the process of enunciation, this initiates a censorship at that level. And it will be the censorship at the level of enunciation that will shape what ultimately gets expressed in the statement. So what we've seen so far is that the subject is split across two dimensions of language, the statement and the enunciation. It is the subject of enunciation that finds itself effaced by the signifier, and it is this threat of effacement wherein the object now makes an appearance. This object emerges for a subject under threat, propping the subject up and rescuing it from effacement. And we'll soon see how this is the very formulation of fantasy. This object of desire is a crucial anchor for the subject, and the statement centers on the subject's relation to the object, while the enunciation marks the subject under erasure that is propelling the formulation of that statement in the first place. With this in mind, we can now return to the dream of the dead father. Lacan situates the signifier "he did not know it" at the level of the statement. What does the father not know? Well, apparently that he was dead, and we see this signifier placed on the line of enunciation. The son experiences pain in the father's lack of knowledge and carries this pain for the father. But not just because the father was dead and did not know it, but also, and we find this out due to the elided signifier, that he felt pain because he was dead as the son wished him to be, a wish the father was also ignorant of. But Lacan notes this wish, which the son has conscious awareness of in waking life, was itself a mask. A mask for what? According to Lacan, it is a mask for the son's ignorance toward his own castration. Now, at this point in the text, admittedly, Lacan seems to make some leaps here that are difficult to follow, and it will take a few more lectures to unpack this claim. What I understand this to mean at this point so far is that desire is located not in the enunciation, nor the statement, but in the relationship between the two, a bond that is effaced in the erasure of a signifier. Repression concerns this effacement. The unconscious fantasy operative here, then, is the lure of killing the father, of the effaced subject's relationship to the little other. The dreamer's pain is a distraction, then, from the fantasy of killing the father. But is this the fundamental desire of the dream? Or is this fantasy a defense against some other desire? To better appreciate how the elided signifier of the dream's wish is a mask for another desire, we have to now again return to the relationship between subject and object, a relationship that is much more complicated than it is among animals. And this is because in the human relationship between subject and object, a signifier intervenes, prohibiting access to an original object, which is called here the object of jouissance. This fundamental rupture in the relation leads to a volatilization of the object. The word volatilization here refers to the process by which a substance is converted from a liquid or solid state to a vapor. Psychoanalytically, this takes place by the mechanism of displacement, whereby something of the original object is preserved in another object, but without that object directly being the object of jouissance. Thus, this is an object that both thwarts satisfaction while maintaining desire. And Lacan uses the word usufruct here in this context to describe it. Usufruct is a legal concept that refers to the right and use and enjoyment of the benefits of someone else's property without actually owning it. And I take this to mean that the substituted object of desire, upon which is displaced the object of jouissance, is one borrowed from and sanctioned by the big other as an acceptable substitute. Lacan contrasts this subject's relationship with the object of desire to the relationship to an object in the case of the hippopotamus. Now, the hippopotamus uses its excrement to mark and protect its territory. However, with humans, the difference is that it is the excrement that becomes of importance, central, and in need of protection, while the original territory that the excrement was designed to protect is eclipsed with regard to desire and unconscious fantasy. This elaboration of the subject object relationship allows us now to return to the dream of the dead father once again and to understand how the elided signifier, as the son wished, functions for the subject. As already mentioned, the father functions as a prop for the son, an object of displacement, like the excrement. The father is ignorant of being dead, and also ignorant of being dead as the son wished. It would seem that the desire of the dream, then, is the son wishing the father to be dead. However, the repressed signifier functions here for another reason. This is because the object of the wish, the father, is itself a mask for something more fundamental. If the father is the object of displacement, then, what is being displaced? The answer concerns the ignorance of the father. The wish for the ignorant father's death is a mask for the son's wish to maintain his own ignorance concerning his own death and the pain of castration associated with that. Staying ignorant here is thus a symbol for the son's failure to assume his own castration and the pain of existing. And as such, while the elided signifier directs us to first take up the repressed Oedipal wish of murdering the father who will kill him in his threat of castration, the more fundamental aspect of the dream is the son's failure to confront the fact that he's already dead. The son is, that is, and he does not know it. That is, of not assuming his own castration and lack, which is the source of his own desire. For this reason, as he wished is in fact situated in between he does not know and he is dead. And what it masks is this: he does not know as he wished, that the dreamer's wish is for ignorance of this lack. At the same time, the tying of desire to lack and its alienation and being displaced onto another object leads to the fear of desire's disappearance. And the term aphonesis, which is introduced by Ernest Jones and talked about here by Lacan, it refers to this fear of the disappearance of desire. The encounter of the subject of lack who fears the disappearance of desire and thus seeks a substitute object to maintain desire is itself the very formulation of fantasy. However, as we see in this dream, the subject's relationship with the substitute object, the dead father, is marked with a great deal of ambivalence. The fact that the father is propped up by the subject while also wishing the father to be dead. The object of fantasy is thus both a way of preserving desire, but also marks a kind of dependence on the other that elicits fear in the subject. Fear of what exactly? The fear of the alienation of one's desire in the other. So for this reason, fantasy sustains desire in two ways, in fact, by locating desire in another substitute object, but also in eliciting fear in the subject, making the subject deviate from the path of satisfying desire, thereby keeping it alive. And the reason why this is important is because should the subject satisfy its desire, get its object, so to say, it would be a catastrophe because that's not the object, that's not the thing. It was always the excrement that we were propping up and keeping away from. And to discover that would be terrifying. So now we're at the final lecture, lecture 7. And we see another version of the graph of desire here, but it's different. In lecture 5, he did not know was placed at the level of the statement, and he was dead at the level of enunciation, while as he wished was placed at the level of desire in its relation to fantasy. However, on this graph in lecture 7, Lacan reverses the order, placing he was dead at the level of the statement and he did not know at the level of enunciation. Why the change from lecture 5 to lecture 7? I think the key is what happened in lecture 6. At first, he does not know refers to the father, and he was dead placed at the level of enunciation is understood in its Oedipal formulation as expressing the child's desire for the father's death, not merely because, as consciously held, the son wished his father dead because of the pain of seeing him suffer and the hardship the son endured in caring for his father while he was dying, but because of the father's function as castrating agent, whose presence is a threat to the son's desire for the original object. This is a good first step, but it is not an endpoint in the dream analysis. So what do we have when inversing the two signifiers? Now, he was dead is explicitly related to the father, an explicit demand for the father's death, which is only the apparent wish of the dream. However, now, he did not know, placed at the level of enunciation, refers to the son's ignorance which he wished for. Ignorance over what? Well, as we've already said, ignorance over his own castration. Ignorance concerning the realization of another master beyond the father that he is beholden to, that being death, which threatens the son with the kind of unbearable existence that he witnessed his father undergoing in the last days of his life. Thus, in the dream, The son props up his ignorant father as an imaginary other, wishing for his death, this thereby serving as a mask so that the son can maintain his own more fundamental wish to remain ignorant of his own death and the fact that he is, in some ways, already dead and being marked by the signifier. And though Lacan doesn't mention it here, we might be able to glean the obsessional neurotic strategy and fundamental ambivalence at play here in relation to the object of desire, the father, as well as the question at play in obsessionals, am I dead or alive? Throughout these lectures, Lacan has led us through various levels of interpretation of the dream about the dead father. What I think this section of the seminar aims to get the audience to appreciate is how it is through the statement that the subject can come to recognize itself and thus recognize the desire which it is in how the statement is formulated. Despite what it seems at times from Lacan, we're encouraged to stick with the letter of the text of the dream and not impute all sorts of wild theories and other extraneous elements into the analysis. And one thing that strikes me as quite remarkable here is how the so called deeper meaning of the dream is ultimately found nowhere else than in the son's surface statement. He was dead and he did not know it. It was only by including one more signifier, as he wished, a wish consciously owned, by the way, by the son, but that was elided in the dream, that we're able then to unfold the unconscious dimension, the process of enunciation, the unconscious fantasy, and ultimately the desire of the dream. Such a process of analysis cannot be arrived at by simply saying to the subject, the analysand, the meaning of the dream is that you wish your father was dead, as this stays too focused on the content. And one can also not say, the meaning of the dream is that you wish to remain ignorant of your own death, which would be true, but arrived at in such a manner that the subject would not recognize themselves in such a statement by the analyst. Instead, Lacan states, do nothing but teach the subject, as it were, to speak, and to recognize himself as a subject in what corresponds to demand, yet without giving him answers. That last part of the quote is critical, as giving an answer to the subject is to play right into the neurotic strategy of finding an answer that is ultimately in service of a defense against anxiety and not a true modification of the subject's position vis-a-vis the question that structures the neurosis. And this is perhaps what Lacan means, where he says, in effect, there is a certain type of person who seeks and another type that finds. Believe me, neurotics find. Well, thanks for watching this to the end. If you found this video helpful and want to see more and support this work, I encourage you to like the video, share it on other platforms, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And if you want to support this work in other ways, you can do so through the super thanks button here on YouTube and also through Patreon, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I would like to thank the following for already supporting this work over on Patreon. Even though I covered a large portion of Seminar 6, I'm really glad I did that. I was initially thinking of covering only maybe 2, possibly 3 lectures, but after working through the entire section on desire and dreams, I realized it really was an integrated whole, and I would have lost the thread if we broke it up more. We'll see if that trend continues. We'll have much fewer videos for Seminar 6 if that's the case, but also more coherent videos because we'll be able to address ideas as they're unpacked in larger sections. But let me know if that is less preferable. So thank you for watching, and until next time.